Every morning, the stepfather placed ice inside his daughter's shoe. No one understood why he did it, until the truth came out and left the entire town in stunned silence. So, what was really hidden behind those pieces of ice? Along the rugged stone road that led to the far end of town, where run-down homes clung tightly to the mountainside, Walter Carter walked slowly, holding the hand of a small girl. They stopped in front of the last house in the row. The walls were stained with time, the paint peeling off in patches of yellow and white, like a wound that never quite healed. Emily, 9 years old, stood still. Her eyes scanned every detail: the wooden door split down the middle, the mold-streaked window pane, and the long crack etched like a root across the left wall. A breeze slipped through the crack in the door, lifting a thin strand of hair from her forehead, but Emily didn't lift a hand to fix it. Her backpack was still on her shoulders. She stood silent, as if waiting for someone to confirm that yes, this was the place she was now supposed to call home. Walter looked at the child and cleared his throat softly. "This is all we've got for now. Tomorrow, I'll fix the faucet and patch up the leaky roof." Emily didn't respond. She just gave a faint nod. Her face had gone pale, and as her small feet moved one step closer to the door, a soft moan escaped her lips. She froze in place, eyes dropping as if to hide something. Then suddenly her face flushed red. She gripped the straps of her backpack tightly and spoke, her voice caught in her throat. "Dad, my foot hurts." Walter froze but didn't ask anything. His brow furrowed for just a second, then he turned and walked briskly into the house. The kitchen was dark, containing only a lopsided table, a few dented aluminum pots, and a foam cooler filled with ice he had gotten from Mrs. Dolores Myers at the corner fish stall. Walter opened the lid and brought down a hammer hard onto the block of ice inside. The sharp, solid sound echoed through the still morning air like something forbidden being shattered. He didn't stop. He kept hammering the ice, steadily, until it broke into small, sharp, icy shards. He poured them into a plastic bucket and carried it to the front door. Emily was still standing there, motionless. Her backpack hung heavily on her shoulder like a piece of her body that couldn't be removed. Walter knelt down in front of her. He took off her left shoe and, without saying a word, gently packed the shards of ice inside. Emily didn't cry, but her face tightened from the pain. Her lips pressed together, eyes wide open. Her little hands trembled slightly, but she didn't pull away. Walter spoke in a low, even voice, as if even a sigh might add to her pain. "Hang in there for a bit, to keep your foot from getting worse." At that very moment, across the street at the corner store, Mrs. Dolores Myers peeked through the window curtain. She turned to a regular customer who was picking out pastries and said, "That man is strange. Every morning he goes to the market asking for leftover ice, says it's for cooking, but I've never seen a wisp of smoke coming out of his chimney." The customer glanced over their shoulder. "Stepfather and stepdaughter?" Mrs. Myers shrugged. "Who knows? But the way that little girl just stands there while he does something to her shoe, it doesn't look right." Once the pink shoe was back on her foot, Emily began to walk. She didn't say a word, and neither did Walter. They simply walked into the small house, behind them, the wooden door creaking closed. The early morning breeze blew into the empty room, rustling the torn curtain like the faint sighs of something long hidden. That night, fog settled in. There was no wind, but the damp cold crept into every crease of skin and strand of hair. Emily lay on an old mattress covered by a worn-out blanket. She faced the wall, never asked for anything, never said a single word about the pain in her leg. Walter sat on the small stool beside her bed. He silently placed the bucket of ice, now nearly melted, next to the mattress. In the dim moonlight shining through the cracked window, he remained still, as if guarding not a child, but something more precious than his own breath. He once had a wife, but life took her back too soon. Her death silenced him. And this child, not his by blood, only the daughter of the woman he had loved, became the only thing left for him to protect. And he protected her in his own way, with ice, with silence, with eyes that never left her limping steps. On the chipped wooden table sat an unused school notebook. Inside, the first page had already yellowed, still blank, but Emily had carefully pasted a small slip of paper in the corner. On it, in clumsy handwriting, she had written, "I will go to school. I won't make Dad sad." Outside, the wind blew away the last leaf clinging to the dead tree in front of the house. No one saw it, but the sound of that leaf touching the ground at midnight felt like a quiet declaration. Life in this place had just begun a new chapter, silent, freezing, and full of challenge. The Monday morning sky wasn't exactly blue. The early week wind swept through the rows of poplar trees in the schoolyard of Horizon Elementary, sending small leaves spinning over the dew-damp bricks in the far corner of the yard. Where one side of the iron fence had rusted away, Emily stood still, clutching the frayed strap of her worn backpack. Her small feet gently bounced against the ground, as if warming up before facing the welcome of a new school day. Her left shoe felt heavier than usual. The cold stone inside, still intact, hadn't quite melted since Walter placed it there just before she got ready. The school bell rang out from an old speaker mounted on the main building's roof. Children poured in from all directions, chirping and skipping down the hallway like sparrows. Emily took a deep breath and stepped through the side gate. No one noticed her, and sometimes that was worse than a judgmental glance. Inside classroom 3A, the air still held the scent of fresh paint and chalk dust. Ms. Rachel Saunders stood at the front, holding the attendance book. Her finger, the red polish on her nail chipped and faded, moved gently down the list of names. When she reached Emily Carter, she lifted her head. Her gaze swept across the room before stopping at the quiet girl who had just walked in and placed her old bag on the desk by the window. No greeting, no clear expression, but that look, silent and measuring, seemed to thicken the air in the room. Emily didn't know what to do except lower her head slightly, her hands gripping the backpack strap in a reflex of self-defense. Cold sweat dampened her palms as she made her way to her seat. Ms. Saunders marked the name with a green pin. Her eyes carried an unspoken question that hovered above the class. Who is this girl? In the back row, Isabella, the curly-haired girl who often wrote poems about moonlight and the scent of sweetbread in her lunchbox, tilted her head toward Emily. Her gaze held a moment of thoughtfulness, not born from idle curiosity, but stirred by the strange quietness of the new girl. Something about her presence altered the air around the desk. Isabella noticed how slowly Emily pulled her leg back, as though every movement was measured. That tiny hand rested on her left ankle with an oddly tender touch. It wasn't how kids usually act when they're hurt. It was more like someone soothing something deeply personal, something familiar. "Are you hurt?" Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid the question might shatter the fragile shell surrounding Emily. Emily didn't respond. She simply looked down at her notebook, its first page still blank. The pencil hadn't touched the paper. Her eyes stayed lowered, but her shoulders were drawn up ever so slightly, as if even silence took great effort. During music class, the music teacher and Mr. Jason Whitman asked the students to stand and sing a shortened version of the folk song La Llorona. Emily rose with the others, but only a few minutes in. Just as the female harmonies were about to begin, she gently buckled at the knees, one hand gripping the edge of the desk for support. Isabella quickly moved to steady her. Mr. Whitman noticed, but said nothing. He simply glanced at Miss Saunders, who was standing by the window. Miss Saunders furrowed her brow, opened her notebook, and jotted something down in red ink before turning to the next page. During recess, the schoolyard buzzed with the sound of running footsteps and children's playful shouts. A game of tag kicked off with a loud countdown that echoed across the yard like a drumbeat. Emily sat alone on a stone bench near the wall beside the storage shed, where the sunlight couldn't reach. Her small hand quietly pressed against her shoe, gently rubbing the area around her ankle. She didn't sigh, didn't move, just kept her eyes on the shadow of Isabella being chased around the yard by Julian Herrera. That girl must have gotten punished. Did you see the way she walks? Julian laughed loudly to the group of boys gathered near the planter box. My mom says kids who get hit by their stepdads usually limp like that, said a boy with spiky hair. Creepy. Bet she's being punished or something, another added. Look at her sitting over there like she's scared of everything. The whispers pierced the air like needles, cutting through the already thin space between a new kid and the rest of the world. Emily didn't turn around. She didn't respond. But her breathing became shallower. She gently pulled her left foot closer to her body, so subtly it was barely noticeable, as if trying to lock the pain away, to bury both the half-melted ice inside her shoe and the feeling of being misunderstood deep inside her small frame. It wasn't fear of being seen, it was knowing that no one really wanted to look. That afternoon, the sun faded slowly. The sky shifted from golden to a dull gray, like a wrinkled curtain. Walter sat by a small charcoal stove, peeling sweet potatoes to make porridge. Emily took off her shoes and placed them by the door, then limped across the room. She seemed to be holding in the pain, because Walter clearly saw the red mark around her ankle, where the insole had rubbed for too long. He opened an old cloth bag, rummaging through the crinkle of paper and the dry clatter of worn-out items. At the bottom, there was only a pinch of salt and an empty medicine tin coated in dust. No ointment, no bandages, no pain relief. Everything they needed to ease her pain was gone, except the ice. The only thing he could still get each morning from the fish stall at the market. Cold and fleeting, but it was all he had left to offer his daughter. Walter said nothing. He stepped outside to where a small bucket held the morning's ice. Quietly, he picked a few pieces, dropped them into a bowl of cold water, then carried it back inside. Emily sat silently on the curved wooden chair, her left leg stretched out and resting lightly on an old cotton towel, one they used to wrap hot cornbread long ago. Walter knelt beside her, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the towel, dipped it into the now slushy water, wrung it gently, and without rushing, placed it on her ankle like someone laying down the last piece of trust onto something incredibly fragile. His eyes didn't look down. They stared into the empty space in front of him, where the crackling fire whispered all the things he had never been able to say out loud. "I wish I had money to take you to a hospital," he murmured, his voice rough. Whether from emotion or smoke, it was unclear. Emily didn't respond right away. After a while, she spoke quietly for the first time that day. "It's okay. As long as you still put the ice in my shoe, that's enough." Walter looked up at his daughter. In her eyes, there were no tears, no resentment, only a quiet, simple kind of trust that hit him like a blow to the chest. A trust that didn't need explanation or proof, only to be protected like a fragile gem in a world full of dust. A piece of ice, meaningless to others, had become the one thing keeping her on her feet. A short sentence, plain and unadorned, had become the strongest confirmation of love. A promise with no oath, but one that burned steadily, like a fire through a long, hard winter. Outside, the distant sound of a bus horn drifted slowly through the air, like the breath of a town that had never truly understood the loneliness of a child limping because of love. Above the roof of Mr. Branson's drugstore, a string of dried chili peppers swayed gently from the porch beam, like a quiet whisper. Emily glanced up as she stepped inside with Walter, her small hand tightening around the worn strap of her backpack. Her left foot touched the floor softly, hesitant but familiar, just like every morning when a cold stone was carefully tucked beneath it. The wooden door creaked open, and the small bell hanging above it jingled with an oddly distant sound. Mr. Harold Branson looked up from his newspaper, his reading glasses slipping low on his nose. He squinted, as if trying to make out who was walking through the door. He was a man who had outlived every rumor in town, and one of the last to still run an independent pharmacy, even though most people now ordered their medicine online or drove to chain stores in Brighton City. Walter stepped up to the counter and spoke in a steady voice, though there was something patient, even weary, behind it. "Good morning, Mr. Branson. I'd like to buy some mild muscle relaxant for children. She tends to get spasms in her left leg." Mr. Branson didn't respond right away. He folded his newspaper, set it aside, then finally spoke, slowly, as if weighing every word. "No prescription, no sale." Walter nodded slightly, not surprised. He simply turned to glance at Emily, who stood silently beside him, her hair falling across her forehead, her eyes gazing up at the older man with quiet stillness. "She really should get checked again," Mr. Branson continued, pulling out a small tin box but leaving it closed. Then, as if compelled to say more without being asked, he lowered his voice and looked past Walter's shoulder into the empty space behind him. "But I've heard the clinic doesn't take anyone without insurance these days. The kind of doctor who used to treat folks just because they cared, well, those days are gone." Walter didn't argue. He simply thanked him and turned to leave. Emily followed without a word, without a complaint. But on their way back, as they passed by the corner store owned by Mrs. Myers, Emily hesitated for a second. She saw the middle-aged woman leaning close to whisper in a neighbor's ear, one hand pointing subtly in their direction. "I see him stuffing something in the girl's shoe every single morning. He really packs it in. Gives me the chills just watching it." The neighbor responded, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Really? What if it's some strange kind of punishment?" Mateo kept walking, never looking back. Luciana quietly quickened her pace, gripping the strap of her backpack as if trying to shrink herself down so no one would notice her. That evening, the dim ceiling light cast a weak yellow glow across the concrete floor. Cold air drifted in through the cracks in the door, carrying the scent of damp wood. Mateo sat in front of a small wooden chest in the corner of the room. The chest was chipped in several places, its hinges rusted, and every time it opened, it creaked like it was complaining about being woken from a long sleep. Inside were all that remained of the past: a faded wedding photo, a few old debt notebooks, and a folder of documents Mateo always kept at the very bottom. He carefully turned each sheet until he found the one he was looking for, a piece of yellowed paper, its edges torn, with smudged ink in several places. The handwritten note appeared, shaky and slanted. Recommendation: apply cold compress daily to prevent nerve degeneration. Signed, Dr. Paul Whitmore, Red Oak Rural Clinic, 2022. There was no official stamp, no medical record number, just the signature of an old doctor Mateo hadn't seen since the end of last year's dry season. Luciana came out of the bedroom, holding a half-finished glass of milk. She sat down beside Mateo, her eyes focused on the paper in his hands. "You still have that, Dad?" "Yeah, it's the only thing I can show people to prove you need ice in your shoe every day." Luciana was silent for a moment, then asked softly, "But will they believe you?" Mateo sighed, his voice drifting away like the wind seeping through the cracks in the door. "I've got the paperwork, sweetheart, but no one wants to read it anyway." The next morning, the schoolyard was once again filled with the lively noise of children. Luciana quietly entered her classroom, her familiar limp drawing a few glances. In the principal's office, Miss Rachel Saunders was on the phone, her brows slightly furrowed. A parent just called in a concern about Luciana. They said she's limping, behaving strangely, and seems withdrawn most of the time. "I'll speak with the child." The teacher stepped into the hallway and signaled for Emily to come over. The girl stopped in front of her, eyes cast down at her shoes. "Emily, what happened to your foot?" Miss Saunders kept her voice gentle, but her eyes still held a trace of suspicion. Emily hesitated for a moment, then mumbled, "I didn't have any ice in my shoe today, so it hurts more than usual." Rachel blinked in surprise. She repeated the words, clearly taken aback. "Ice? In your shoe?" Emily gave a small nod. Ms. Saunders didn't ask anything else. She turned straight back into the office, picked up the phone, and dialed the number for Child Protective Services. "Hello, this is Rachel Saunders, third grade teacher at Horizon Elementary. I'd like to report a student showing signs of physical distress. She often walks with a limp, and this morning she said, without ice in her shoe, the pain gets worse." There was silence on the other end for a few seconds before a voice replied, "We'll proceed according to protocol." That afternoon, Walter received a call from an unfamiliar number. The man's voice was clear and cold. "Mr. Walter Carter, we will be arriving at your residence tomorrow morning to assess the living conditions of Emily Carter. Please have all relevant documentation ready." Walter lowered the phone slowly and looked out the window. The sun hadn't fully set yet, but the light had dimmed considerably. Wind was picking up again. He walked over to the table where the old piece of paper still lay untouched. Gently, he ran his fingers over the smudged handwriting and whispered, as if speaking only to himself, "I have the paperwork, but no one ever wants to read it." Early mornings in Willow Creek were always hazy, as if the sun itself hesitated to touch the weathered rooftops. On the dirt road, still marked with old tire tracks, a heavy layer of mist clung to the bare almond tree in the front yard, making the scene even more silent. There were no barking dogs, no rumbling scooters, only the morning wind slipping through the door cracks, carrying the chill from the southern mountains. Walter Carter's white and yellow house kept its windows tightly shut, the faded paint like a dream that had never been repainted a second time. Inside, on a wobbly dining table propped up by a piece of broken brick, Walter sat quietly, wrapping the last piece of ice in an old cloth. He glanced toward Emily, the young girl wearing worn gray socks, her head lowered, hands gently gripping the strap of her school bag. No one spoke. Mornings in their home were never loud. Walter lifted his daughter's left shoe and carefully tucked the wrapped ice inside. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from that vague anxiety that had been with him since waking. He tried not to let her notice, but just as he placed the shoe back on the floor, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't loud or urgent, but firm and deliberate. The sound made both father and daughter turn their heads at once. Outside, a silver gray car was parked right up against the front gate. The car door remained open, engine still running. A man stepped out, wearing a dark suit. The badge on his left lapel glinted faintly in the weak morning light. His face was strangely familiar, the kind people only ever saw on television or in government files, never in real life. Walter rose and walked to the door. When he opened it, the man was already standing at the threshold. "Good morning. I'm Charles Benton from the State Child Protective Services." He held out his badge, as if that alone authorized any decision he might make. "Are you the legal guardian of Emily Carter?" Walter froze. In his hand, the ice was still half exposed from the cloth. As he nodded slightly, his fingers loosened. The ice slipped to the rough tile floor and cracked in two. One half rolled beneath the table, the other landed just near the door. "I'm here following reports from the school and a number of parents," Charles continued in a steady, emotionless tone. "There's concern about recurring physical harm. We need to assess the child's condition." At that moment, Emily stepped into the living room, having just finished tying her shoes. Her eyes froze when she saw the stranger. Charles quickly reached into his jacket pocket and took a photo of her shoes. Walter stepped back slightly, his voice low. "I can explain. I haven't hurt her. I'm only following a doctor's advice. Her leg, it needs to be cold every morning to keep the muscles from stiffening." "Do you have any documentation to support that?" Charles asked without looking up. Walter dug through the drawer and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, its edges yellowed and ink smudged from moisture. He held it out, his hand almost pleading. Elias skimmed the paper briefly, then folded it and handed it back with a dismissive shake of his head and a faint smirk. "There's no official medical signature, no official stamp. This document isn't valid enough to disprove the allegations." Luciana stepped forward and gently took Mateo's hand. Her eyes met the man's with surprising determination, as if, for the first time, she had found the courage to say what needed to be said. "My dad doesn't hurt me." "Never." Elias looked down at the girl. His facial expression barely changed. Without saying another word, he opened his folder and began writing something, never lifting his eyes again. Mateo sat down slowly, his gaze fixed on the broken piece of ice on the floor, his chest tightening. He knew that with people like Elias, even the truth needed to come with official stamps just to stand a chance of being believed. On the way to school, Luciana could feel unfamiliar eyes watching her. A mother on the sidewalk pulled her daughter close and crossed to the other side of the street, whispering something in a low, half-scolding tone. Luciana kept walking quietly, each step deliberate, tense, as she tried not to let the stone inside her shoe shift out of place. When she arrived at her classroom, Miss Rosa glanced at her for a moment, then turned away without a word. The school day dragged on under a heavy silence. No one dared to approach Luciana, but everyone kept looking at her. The stares came from children too young to grasp the weight of right and wrong, mimicking the caution they'd seen from the adults around them, and sometimes a glance, one thoughtless, unkind glance, could cut deeper than words. At noon, Mateo waited for his daughter outside the school gate. He stood quietly beneath the shade of an old almond tree, his worn-out cloth cap doing little to block the sun. When Luciana came out, he smiled faintly and gave a small wave, but the girl only lowered her head and hurried past him. Mateo didn't take it personally. He understood. His daughter was trying to swallow a pain that no one had ever taught her how to carry without choking. That afternoon, the sky was covered in thick gray clouds. A strong wind rattled the back door as Mateo reheated the leftover porridge. He didn't need to look, he already knew whose car had just pulled up. The engine hadn't even been turned off yet when he heard footsteps approaching. Two uniformed officers walked into the yard, their faces unreadable. Elias followed behind them, holding a document stamped with a red seal. "We are executing a 72-hour temporary custody order to support the investigation," he said, without looking at anyone, as if reading straight from the page. Luciana stood nearby, a spoon still in her hand, unwashed. Her eyes widened in shock as the officers moved closer. She screamed, "I'm not going anywhere! Daddy, please don't let them take me!" Mateo stepped forward and spread his arms in front of her. "Please, give me a little more time. I can prove it." Elias shook his head. "The order has already been approved." Luciana screamed louder, tears streaming down her chin. Her shoes, still holding the ice, hadn't even been removed. She was lifted off the ground, arms reaching out, legs kicking, as her cries echoed through the street. Mateo dropped to his knees in the middle of the yard, clutching the tiny shoes with ice still inside, still holding the morning's cold. He hadn't managed to wrap them back up in the cloth, and now there was no one left to wear them. A soft rain began to fall. Tiny droplets hit the ice in the shoes, melting them slowly, just like the last remnants of belief inside a poor stepfather's heart. Afternoons in Willow Creek always arrived slower than anywhere else, as if even the sunlight hesitated to filter into that small town. The wind slipped through the wooden window shutters, carrying the scent of dry grass and fine dust from the dirt road outside the New Dawn Community Center. Emily was led into a small room at the very end of the third hallway. Her steps were slow, partly because of the pain in her leg, and partly because her heart hadn't yet made sense of what had just happened. The door creaked open. Inside, a boy around 11 years old was folding pieces of newspaper into the shape of a swallow. He looked up when he saw someone new walk in. He didn't smile, but his eyes weren't entirely distant. "You're new here, huh?" he asked, without waiting for a reply before turning back to his unfinished paper bird. Emily gave a soft nod and placed her backpack on the bed beside her. Her eyes briefly scanned a wooden dresser with a round metal knob. The walls were spotless, not a single smudge or fingerprint. Everything in the room had been cleaned meticulously, almost coldly. The boy clicked his tongue. "I'm Ethan. I've been here ever since my mom locked the front door and left me hungry for 3 straight days. It's fine now. I'm kind of getting used to it." Emily didn't know what to say. She just lowered her head. When she gently pulled her left foot out of her shoe, a soft whimper escaped before she could stop it. Her ankle was a bit swollen and flushed red. Ethan glanced over and frowned. "You're limping. What happened?" Emily didn't answer right away. After she had sat down on the bed, she spoke softly, almost whispering, "If I don't have a cold stone in my shoe, my foot really hurts." Ethan tilted his head. "A cold stone?" "Yeah, a cold stone. My dad always puts one in my left shoe every morning before I go to school. Without it, I can't lift my foot." Silence stretched between the two children. Outside, a wind chime on the magnolia tree rang faintly in the breeze. Suddenly, Ethan stood up and ran into the hallway to call for a staff member. A few moments later, the on-duty doctor arrived to examine Emily's leg. They brought her some pain relief, a small orange capsule, and handed her a cup of warm water. It was nearly dusk. Emily swallowed the medicine, but her eyes remained fixed on the window. On the other side of town, Walter stopped in front of the city public affairs office. He wore a pressed old shirt and shoes polished as if he were heading to some formal ceremony. But he had come only to ask one question. "May I see the girl?" Charles Benton looked up from a thick stack of case files, his irritation unmistakable. "We've already informed you. During the investigation period, you are not permitted to have private contact with Emily. This is to ensure objectivity." "Just a few minutes. I won't speak, if that's what you require. I just want to see her." Walter's voice was slow, not pleading, not angry. Just the weary tone of a man who had given everything for a child who wasn't even his by blood. Charles didn't reply. He simply flipped to the next page. as if the denial had already been issued with the motion itself. Back at the empty house, Walter rinsed a piece of ice he had picked up from Mrs. Myers's fish stall. He wrapped it in the old cloth once again and placed it gently on the small wooden table, right where Emily used to sit to eat her porridge. The vacant chair echoed a silence that rang out like a bell, unanswered. That night, over at New Dawn Youth Center, Emily couldn't sleep either. She kept turning, her leg throbbing with a dull ache. Ethan lay in a deep sleep beside her, murmuring something under his breath before falling quiet again. Emily pulled the blanket up to her chest, her forehead damp with sweat. By midnight, she jolted upright and folded her left leg in, cradling her ankle with both hands as if afraid it might shatter into pieces. Her foot trembled uncontrollably, her knee jerking in rhythmic spasms. A sob escaped her lips, then another. She called out softly, but no one heard. Everyone was asleep. She climbed out of bed, staggering, then finally collapsed onto the cold floor. The pain surged like a wave, rising from her ankle to her spine, and then, suddenly, she screamed, "I need my shoes with ice! I need Daddy's ice!" Her cry startled a nurse awake, who rushed into the room. The scene stunned everyone. Emily was curled into herself, hands clamped around her left foot, her face pale, lips pressed tight to hold back another scream. The resident physician arrived moments later and administered a muscle relaxant injection. They had never seen such a severe reaction. Nervous response linked to localized cold stimulus, the doctor whispered, quickly jotting notes into her chart. Emily drifted off soon after, sweat still glistening on her neck. Back at home, Walter sat beneath the dim yellow light. His hand brushed across the old medical note. Its ink faded, the handwriting of Dr. Paul Whitmore now little more than blurred smudges. He picked up a pen and opened a fresh sheet of paper, without any recipient name or return address. He simply wrote the words tilted like a heart trembling inside his chest. "Please believe that I have loved that child with everything I have left." When he folded the letter, Walter didn't cry, but in his eyes something fractured, like a tiny piece of ice hitting the tiled floor. A small sound that sliced through the silence like a blade. Thin light filtered through the rows of eucalyptus trees, casting streaks of shimmering mist across the damp road. A black crow perched on the power line, tilting its head as it watched a pale blue social services van slowly roll into the small town square. Inside the vehicle, Mariana Doyle sat upright, her eyes fixed on the window, though her mind lingered on a report she had finished reading the night before. The attending doctor's voice from the center still echoed in her memory. The patient responded well to localized cold stimulation, signs of dependency observed due to therapy interruption. Mariana hadn't added anything to the report. She had simply closed the file and sat in silence, as if she were holding something far too fragile to speak of. When the van came to a stop, she stepped down, her shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. The house in front of her was unremarkable. The yellowed walls were mottled with moss, the tin roof dulled to a silvery gray, and one corner of the glass window was cracked and patched with a sheet of transparent plastic. But what made Mariana pause wasn't the wear of the home, it was the man sitting on the front porch, quietly chiseling at a broken table leg. Beside him sat a small basin of water, where pieces of ice were slowly melting into clear liquid. She didn't speak right away. Walter Carter seemed to know someone had arrived, but he didn't stop working. A moment later, he looked up, his eyes carrying the weight of years without rest, but still holding a calmness that Mariana hadn't expected. "Are you from the center?" Walter asked, his voice hoarse but not rough. "Yes. My name is Mariana Doyle. I've been assigned to review Emily's case file." Walter nodded. He set the piece of wood down, wiped his hands on a cloth, and gestured to the backless wooden chair across from him. "Have a seat. The sun isn't too strong yet." Mariana sat down, her eyes glancing at the basin of melting ice beside them. "You still collect ice every day?" Walter gave a faint smile, not looking at her. "I don't have a refrigerator. I get the ice from the fish market every morning. The vendors know me by now. I don't even have to ask. I just need enough to put in her shoe, to keep her leg from locking up like before." Mariana bit her lip. She had read countless reports, handled dozens of cases, but this was the first time she had heard a father talk about healing his daughter with something so seemingly useless in the eyes of others. She opened her notebook, but didn't write a word. "Do you have any documentation to prove that?" Matteo stood up and walked inside. A moment later, he returned holding an old envelope, its corners yellowed with age. He took out a folded piece of paper, its handwriting nearly faded over time. "This is from Dr. Octavio at the San Isidro Clinic. He doesn't work there anymore, but he was the first one who told me my girl needed ice every day. He wrote it by hand because I couldn't afford a formal report." Mariana took the paper. She couldn't make out the full text, but the final line was still legible. "Requiere exposizione diarie al frio loco per evento d'ordine neurologico progressivo." She looked up at Matteo. He had already sat down again, his eyes no longer focused on her, but drifting somewhere far away, where the sound of a child's footsteps once echoed every morning. "Would you be willing to go with me to the clinic to verify this?" Mariana asked. Matteo nodded without hesitation. The San Isidro Clinic sat at the edge of town, built from red brick with a low roof and a faint antiseptic smell seeping through the old grout. Mariana walked straight to the reception desk, where an elderly nurse was jotting down notes. "Dr. Octavio doesn't work here anymore," the nurse said after hearing the request. "He retired over a year ago. Most of the old records are stored manually, but if you want to search, I can open the archive room." Inside a small room at the end of the hallway, dust coated the boxes of files. Mariana sifted through them herself, her eyes straining after more than an hour of searching. Finally, she found a worn blue-green folder with the name Emily Carter, written in faded purple ink. Inside were a few pages, mostly nurses' notes, but the last page made her stop. Even though the ink had faded, the central line remained intact. "Pacienti con signos de atrofia ad nerviosa periferica. Se recomrisa, compresa, fria diaria. No hay acebo a tratamiento integral por falta de recursos." Mariana held the paper like it was a certificate of exoneration, not just for Matteo, but for a little girl who had been crying out for her father in dreams no one else could hear. That same afternoon, Mariana returned to Horizon Elementary. She asked to meet with Miss Rachel Saunders, the teacher who had filed the original report. In the teacher's meeting room, Rosa sat behind the desk, her posture as stern as always. Mariana placed a copy of the medical report on the table and waited silently. Rosa glanced at it. Her eyes shifted slightly. "I was just doing my duty," she said, her voice neither loud nor soft. "And if that duty turns out to be wrong, who fixes it?" Mariana asked gently. Rosa didn't respond right away. She looked out the window where the children were playing tag. Their laughter echoed from a distance, never quite reaching the place where she sat. "When I saw the girl limping, I thought," she paused, unable to go on. "I thought I was protecting her." Mariana didn't argue. She only said one final sentence before leaving the room, where sunlight filtered through a thin curtain. "Maybe this is the first time we were wrong, but I believe it's also the first time we have a chance to make it right." On the way back, Mariana pulled out her phone. She dialed the number of Dr. Ellen Foster, a neurologist in the neighboring city. "Ellen, I need you to verify something. This might be one of those rare cases where we ended up on the wrong side." "Send me the documents," Ellen replied. "If what you're saying is true, then for the first time, I actually hope I'm wrong." Mariana looked up at the amber-hued sky of late afternoon. The wind carried the scent of damp wood and pine resin across the road. Inside her, something had cracked, not broken, just shifted, as if she too was relearning how to be human, starting with a small stone inside a child's shoe. In the second-floor meeting room of the Child Protection Center, the ceiling fan spun slowly and steadily, like the breath of someone trying hard to stay calm. Catherine Doyle sat at the head of the table, her hand resting on a gray file folder with frayed edges and soft creases at the corners, showing how often it had been opened and read. Beside her was Dr. Ellen Foster, a slender woman with round-framed glasses and sharp eyes that seemed to scan every blurred line of text as if searching for something hidden. Across from them sat attorney Allison McRae, dressed in a forest green suit, her gestures precise but never lacking in grace. Ellen was the first to speak, her voice low and deliberate, as though every word had been chosen with care. Daily cold therapy is a recommended intervention for chronic peripheral nerve damage. This document confirms that Mr. Walter Carter's actions were not only medically sound, but also the only viable method available to him, given that he had no health insurance and couldn't afford any advanced treatment options. Allison leaned back slightly, her fingers interlaced, her tone softer yet no less resolute. What haunts me most isn't the diagnosis. It's that a poor father, with nothing in his hands but a single piece of ice and an old rag, did the right thing every single day in silence. Not just right, but courageously right. The door to the room creaked open suddenly, its hinges letting out a faint sound like a delayed warning. Charles Benton entered with his familiar posture. Crisp white shirt without a single wrinkle, dark tie, and footsteps measured like a ticking clock. He said nothing, simply set his briefcase on the table and let his gaze pass over every face in the room until it stopped at the open file in the center. Ellen said nothing. She simply pushed the document toward Charles. He glanced at it, then reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out his glasses, slipping them on. When he finished reading, his face darkened. His lips pressed into a thin line, and he removed his glasses slowly. I was following procedure. Everything I did was within the responsibilities of this department. Catherine remained still, only her eyes growing colder than usual. Procedure doesn't protect children. In this case, it was the father who did that. A silence settled over the room like a thick curtain. Allison gently twisted the pen in her fingers. The soft clicking sound was barely audible, yet in the stillness of the room, it rang out like a quiet reminder that time was moving forward, and so was the truth. Charles didn't respond. He gathered his briefcase and left behind a short sentence, "I will review the file." The door clicked shut behind him. In the pale golden light of late morning, Catherine watched his retreating figure, then turned to Ellen and Allison. "We have to get Walter Carter back to his daughter." In the medical room of the center, Emily sat curled up on a white plastic chair, her shoulders rounded as if trying to hide inside her jacket. Her face was pale, but her eyes shone clearer than in previous days. A nurse entered, holding a small cloth in her hand, inside of which was a carefully wrapped piece of ice. She knelt down in front of Emily and spoke softly. "You can try again if you'd like. The doctor says the cold might help ease the pain." Emily took the cloth with both hands. She slowly unwrapped it, as if touching a memory. The small ice cube, oddly shaped and clear as crystal, shimmered under the fluorescent light above. She placed it inside her old left shoe, slipped her foot in, and sat quietly for a moment. "And this cold? It reminds me of Dad." The words slipped out like a breath, not meant for anyone in particular, but everyone present heard them. The nurse didn't respond. She simply placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, then quietly left the room. That afternoon, Walter received a call from the center. Valeria's voice on the other end was low and steady. "You're allowed to come, but current guidelines still don't permit direct contact. We'll arrange a supervised visit." Walter didn't ask for more. He simply said, "I'll be there right away." Down the long hallway leading to the isolation area, Walter walked slowly, gripping the strap of his baseball cap tightly. Security staff guided him to the visitation room. A thick glass wall divided the space, but it couldn't block the longing that filled the air. Emily entered from the other side, wearing a beige sweater, her hair neatly tied at the back. When she saw Walter, her eyes lit up and she walked toward him slowly. Walter stepped up to the glass. Neither of them spoke. There was no need. Emily raised her hand and placed her palm against the glass. Walter did the same. His large, rough hand covered her small one through the cold divider. They looked at each other. No words were spoken, but their eyes said everything. They spoke of an apology for being apart, a quiet thank you for not letting go, and a promise that no matter how many layers of glass stood between them, love would still find its way through. Outside the glass, Catherine, Ellen, and Valeria stood in silence. No one held a recorder, no one said a word. Their silence was not avoidance, it was sacred respect for a moment that needed no narration. Some things can't be captured on tape or legal record, yet they carve themselves deeply into memory, like the unspoken cry of two hands meeting across a wall of cold glass. That morning, dewdrops clung to the rotting wooden fence along the side of Horizon Elementary as if they had never dried since the night before. A small sparrow, its feathers soaked and glossy, stood silently on a purple-flowered jacaranda branch for so long it looked like part of the wall behind it. On the stone-paved schoolyard, a few dry leaves had been blown together by the wind into a narrow gray-brown strip, still and silent, just like the mood in the hearts of those who were waiting. The school gate opened. Emily Carter walked in, gripping the strap of her backpack tightly. Her school uniform dress, knee-length, was slightly wrinkled at the hem. Her steps were slow, slightly limping, but there was no longer any sense of hiding. Each heavy step no longer carried fear of being mocked, but rather a kind of careful resolve, as if each movement silently declared she was still here, still present in the very school that had once turned its back on her. No one laughed. There was no whispering. The kids passing by stayed quiet. Some deliberately looked away, while others hesitated, as if they wanted to say something, but the words got stuck somewhere between their throats and their tightly clenched hands. Inside the classroom, Emily's desk was still in its usual spot by the window, facing the back courtyard. Someone had wiped the surface clean, placed the pencil case that had fallen the week before back in its place, and neatly folded a white napkin on top. Emily unfolded it. Inside was a small stone, wrapped in a piece of soft blue fabric. A handwritten message in blue ink read, "This girl doesn't need new shoes. She just needs to be believed." She didn't know who had left it. She didn't need to. Quietly, she folded the note back up, placed it into her desk, then took out her book from her backpack as if nothing had happened, though the gesture warmed her more than any public apology ever could. The first lesson began in silence. Miss Rachel Saunders walked in, her voice softer than usual. She didn't look directly at Emily during roll call, but when her gaze swept across the last row, there was a brief moment when she paused. Just one breath, yet enough for every student in the room to notice. The second period passed quietly. No one whispered. No one passed notes. No one giggled. Even Julian Herrera, once the loudest kid in the class, just kept his head down, scribbling notes, occasionally glancing at Emily, then quickly looking away again. During recess, the schoolyard was shaded by tall old trees. Emily made her way to the back corner, where she used to sit alone in the past, back when her classmates' laughter still echoed behind her. She sat on the old wooden bench, her hand gently massaging her left ankle. The bruise had faded, but the lingering chill from the stone inside her shoe still gave her comfort, a silent reminder of the father waiting for her at home. A shadow approached. Julian. He stopped in front of her, hands in his pockets, his posture visibly uneasy. I used to say a lot of stupid stuff. I didn't realize how wrong it was." Emily didn't look up. She simply answered in a soft voice, as if speaking more to herself than to him. "If you want a fresh start, then be a friend. No need to explain." Between them was just enough space, not awkward, not tense, just the quiet understanding of forgiveness that didn't need promises. Julian nodded, then turned to walk away, but this time it wasn't retreat. It was the beginning of something new. That afternoon, Walter came to pick Emily up earlier than usual. He stood at the entrance of the schoolyard, his rough hands gripping the strap of her backpack. When she walked up to him, he bent down to tighten the loose strap, his hand giving it a gentle squeeze. Not firm, but just enough for Emily to feel the care that had always been there, even in silence. Miss Rachel passed by, pausing in front of the two. Her gaze was no longer as stern as it had been. There was something in it that looked like a remorse that had ripened with time. "I was wrong," she said, without introduction, without preamble. "I forgot that a look can't replace a question." Walter didn't reply right away. He looked at his daughter, then back at Rachel. "I don't blame you," he said calmly. "I blame myself for staying silent." They both stood quiet. No one mentioned the pain of the past. No one offered excuses. But in that brief moment, something like understanding sparked, like the last rays of sunlight slipping through the leaves, brightening a forgotten corner of the yard. That night, a new message appeared on the school's main bulletin board. No author's name, no official stamp, no decoration, just neat white chalk lines that read, "Not everything unusual is wrong, but every rushed judgment always is." The rumors stopped, the whispers faded, the questions no longer needed to be spoken out loud. All that remained were longer glances between people, nods in place of words, and the quiet settling of small stones in the minds of those who had once misunderstood, once ignored, and now began to understand. Back home, Emily opened her backpack and pulled out the last remaining stone, placing it into a clean cloth her mother once used. She looked at Walter and said quietly, "I don't need the stone today, but I still carry it because I want to remember." Walter didn't answer. He just sat down beside her, his hand resting on the table, his eyes drifting far away. After a while, he spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper. "There are things we do that no one sees, but you see them. And that's enough." Emily nodded and leaned against his shoulder. Outside, a soft breeze swept through, carrying the scent of damp earth and the sound of falling leaves, like a lesson no book could ever teach. A row of people bowed their heads deeply. Some clasped their hands in silent prayer. Others simply held the hand of the child beside them. "I'm not angry," Walter finished. "I just hope, starting tomorrow, no other child will need a stone in their shoe just to be believed by adults." After the hearing, the town didn't return to normal right away, but something had quietly shifted. The next morning, Miss Rachel Saunders walked into her classroom and wrote a sentence in large letters across the board. "Do not judge before you understand. Do not stay silent when a question needs to be asked." The children didn't clap, but each of them quietly copied the sentence into their notebooks. The most important lessons often aren't found in textbooks. At the corner coffee shop, the Willow Voice was displayed prominently on the front rack. The front page featured a story by Henry Miller, a young journalist who had followed the case from the beginning. The headline wasn't flashy, but it made readers pause longer than usual. The stone was a treatment, but love was the true cure. Henry didn't dwell on scandal. He didn't point fingers. He simply described an early morning at the fish market when a man quietly came to collect leftover ice once the fish had been packed away. He wrote, "That father wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a specialist, but he healed his daughter with the oldest medicine known to humankind: unconditional love." That same afternoon, while Walter was wiping down an old table in his woodworking shed, Mrs. Dolores Myers appeared at the doorway. She wasn't wearing a hat. In her hands was a worn silver tin box, cleaned and wrapped carefully in a paper towel. Her eyes were red. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "I don't know how to apologize the right way, but inside this box are a few clean pieces of ice I've kept chilled. If you'll allow me, starting tomorrow, I'll prepare the ice for you, so she can walk into school without fear of the cold." Walter looked at her for a long moment. He didn't nod. He didn't shake his head either. He simply reached out and took the box, then placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Back at her desk by the window, Emily placed the silver box from Mrs. Myers beside her books. She opened the lid slowly. Inside were 3 round pieces of ice, each wrapped carefully in a layer of thin cloth. Between them was a small folded note written in slanted, handwritten script. "I'm sorry I didn't believe. And thank you for not giving up." Emily held the note in her hands and read each word slowly, as if afraid to miss a single meaning. Then she smiled. Not the innocent smile of a little girl, but the quiet, steady smile of someone who had walked through darkness, who had known pain, and who now understood that some hearts take longer to learn how to love, but once they do, they never forget. A night rain had just swept through Willow Creek, leaving droplets clinging to the tin roofs like they hadn't yet decided to vanish. The mimosa tree in front of the school still shivered gently, its delicate blossoms caught along the rooftop gutters. The sky that morning wasn't entirely blue, but rays of sunlight from the east pierced through the clouds and stretched long golden streaks across the porch. In a small room at the end of the ground floor hallway of the Bravehearts Recovery Center, Emily was sitting by the window. She had grown a little since the day Walter carried her through the rain. It was still that quiet face, but now her eyes were wider, more open to the world. On the table sat a small wooden box. Inside it, several clear, glistening stones wrapped in thin, frayed cloth, cold to the touch. No one had asked her to keep that box. It wasn't listed in any physical therapy program, nor included in any physician's treatment plan. but it was the one thing Emily arranged herself every week. She wiped down each edge of the box, replaced the lining, and checked the count of the stones as though she were caring for a memory too fragile to let go. Strong Roots Foundation, an organization that supports children with peripheral nerve damage, had decided to sponsor all of Emily's recovery expenses after reading a news article by young reporter Henry Miller about the father who silently placed a stone in his daughter's shoe every morning. There were no petitions, no appeals. The foundation issued a single sentence in their confirmation letter. Some kinds of love require no validation. We just need to do the rest. For 6 straight months, Emily was treated by a specialized team of rehabilitation doctors. She learned how to engage the nerves damaged since childhood, adapted to the neuromuscular therapy machines, and attended regular treatment sessions. Some days she fell 3 times in the same hallway, yet refused help from the medical staff. Some nights, the pain in her legs throbbed so much she couldn't sleep, but still she declined sleeping aids. In every one of those moments, she held tightly to a folded white cloth, not one soaked in ice, but one that carried the faint scent of old wood from Walter's hands. On the final day of her treatment program, Dr. Sylvia Grant, the head of the recovery team, sat across from Emily. On the table lay a nerve conduction chart with smooth, steady lines. There were no more spasms, no more uneven temperatures between her legs, and no more daily cold compress prescriptions. The doctor asked softly, "How are you feeling, Emily?" The girl slowly folded her hands in her lap, her eyes lowered toward the tip of her new shoes, the first pair she had ever chosen without needing to test them with ice inside. "I don't feel pain anymore, but I still remember the cold against my foot, because that's how my dad loved me." No one in the room responded. Not even the doctor, who had witnessed hundreds of recoveries, could find words. She simply placed a hand on the file, nodded, and remained silent for a long time. 3 days later, the mayor of Willow Creek held a small ceremony at Horizon Elementary. There was no red banner, no band, just a wooden board set up next to the garden with a simple message handwritten in chalk. "Some stones hold your steps steadier than any promise." The ceremony began with the voice of Ms. Rachel Saunders. She read each word slowly, trying not to let her voice break when she reached Walter's name. In the front row, he sat beside Emily. The shoes the girl wore that day were plain white leather, the laces freshly tied. There were no stones inside. The mayor handed Walter a certificate of gratitude. He walked to the microphone, holding the frame in his hands. He carried no paper, had no speech. His hands still had a bit of sawdust from the workshop. "I'm just a woodworker," he said, not looking at the cameras but at his daughter. "But that girl is the finest thing I've ever made." There was no applause after that line. The crowd fell completely silent, not because they lacked emotion, but because no one wanted to interrupt a moment that full. The ceremony ended in peace. No one rushed to give extra speeches. No one used the event to elevate themselves. Everyone quietly walked away, some glancing back toward the fence where Emily stood. The next morning, the air turned colder than usual. Northern winds carried the scent of damp soil and fresh grass after the rain. In the familiar small kitchen, Walter was peeling an avocado, placing each slice gently onto a wooden plate. The soft sound of a door opening echoed behind him. Emily walked out, wearing a brown fur-lined jacket. He looked at her, paused for a second, then asked, "Are you feeling okay?" Emily nodded. She sat down, reached for her new shoes. There was no towel, no stone, and no question from him. "Today I want to walk on my own," she said, her voice as light as a falling leaf, yet her eyes were steady. Then she looked at her father and gave a small smile like the morning breeze. "Tomorrow, can you still wrap a little stone for me, so I'll remember why I ever stood up in the first place?" Walter didn't answer. He simply stepped toward the water basin by the back door. He dipped his hand into the half-melted ice, chose the smallest, clearest piece, rinsed it clean, dried it, then gently placed it inside the old cloth. This story didn't end with applause or the word "the end" at the bottom of a page. It closed with the quiet image of a stepfather gently washing a small piece of ice, while a dark-haired little girl stepped out onto the porch, standing before a pale yellow fence. The very spot where she was first called daughter. The sun had risen. Its light wasn't blinding, But it was enough to clearly illuminate each step she took as she walked away from that house, carrying within her a kind of gratitude that would never melt. Some stories don't need a flood of tears to leave a lasting impact. Sometimes, all it takes is an old pair of shoes, a cold stone, and a silent father to stir the most tender parts of our hearts. The story of Walter and Emily isn't just about overcoming illness, it's a journey of trust between human beings. In a world where judgment too often races ahead of understanding, the truth still finds its voice. And the most beautiful truth of all is this: those who love quietly, who sacrifice with no demand for recognition, will always be rewarded. Those who rush to judge and cast suspicion will, eventually, have to face the truth. Dear friend, after watching this story unfold, have you ever asked yourself, have I ever stayed silent when someone needed to be understood rather than judged? Have you seen a bit of yourself in Walter, the man who didn't need praise, only the strength in his daughter's steps? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd truly love to hear what this story stirred in you, not just as a viewer, but as someone who can relate. And before you go, may I ask, how have you been lately? Has life felt overwhelming? If so, I hope this little story brought even a small sense of warmth to ease your heart. Wishing you peace always. And if you believe this story deserves it, don't forget to like and share it, so that kindness can go a little further today.